I'm an engineer by training and spent the last 20 so years of my career in the building industry, heavy construction materials. I'm also a World Trade Center 9/11 survivor, having been there and seen the destruction of that day. And it kind of awakened my thinking on the question of why are our assets, our buildings, our communities so vulnerable? Not so much what most people focus on the hazards. I ask the question, why are the assets weak? And it kind of put me down this pathway of looking at how we build things, how we permit and so forth. And I saw we have a systemic problem. And when I retired about 7 years ago, I decided I needed to communicate this to the public, who are every one of us lives in a house or an apartment or some sort of dwelling. For most of us, the home is the most important purchase of our life. And yet we see all the destruction going on primarily in homes. So I wanted to educate consumers.
So what is your role at Florida International University, and what is the Resilience Action Fund?
When I retired, I had done some work previously with FIU, recruiting their students and supporting some of their research. So they invited me to join their Extreme Events Institute, kind of as a volunteer staff member. So they gave me a nice office and access to all their resources and facilities. But I'm a volunteer, and I help them in their programs. I also chair their external advisory board and kind of provide kind of input into what they're doing, and also recruit interns for my nonprofit that I started at the same time, called the Resilience Action Fund. And the nonprofit really aimed at educating the public. I wrote a book called Resilience, the Ultimate Sustainability, that you can find on Amazon, and also it's available as an audio book and even translated to Spanish. So the book is marketed through the nonprofit. A PBS documentary was made based on the book that was sponsored by the nonprofit. And if you go to the nonprofit's website, buildingresilient.com, one word, Building Resilient, you'll see a lot of resources there. And we'll touch on some of those, in the talk, hopefully.
Okay, so now I'd like you to tell me about the wall of wind on the graphic behind you. Where did the idea come from, and how did it become a reality? Were there precursors of this, or is this a relatively new innovation? And what role did you play in its development?
Yeah, the wall of wind really came in the aftermath of Hurricane Andrew, which devastated South Florida in late 92. And the desire to improve the building standards and also to do studies on what lasts, what survives, and what doesn't survive. So it started initially as a small facility sponsored by insurance companies and also the state, and gradually grew. And in the last 10 years, it's a full-scale hurricane testing facility that you can test buildings, small houses, let's say, or scaled down units up to Category 5 winds. That's 160-mile-an-hour winds. You can also combine it with rain, wind-driven rain. And also recently they added a downburst facility for wind that's not coming horizontally, but is coming down directly from the sky. And the National Science Foundation, NSF, in the last couple of years adopted the wall of wind as a premier research facility. So universities from around the country are using it to conduct research, but it's also open to private companies to test their products, test their building methods, and see whether they can withstand the high wind levels. And I advise in that. I wasn't involved in the construction of it, but right now, the NSF has charged the Florida International University with a project to expand it even further and perhaps build an even bigger facility that will go above 160 miles an hour, but more importantly, will combine storm surge that we see happening in combination with hurricanes, where you can have, waters coming in 10 feet, 15 feet, maybe as high as 20 feet. So we'll be able to simulate the combination of wind and water in one facility, but that's at least 5 or more years away from being built.
Okay, could you provide a little more description of how this technically works, like the size of it, how the wind is created, and then some of the other details that might be of interest?
Yeah, basically, if you visit FIU's campus, which is about a 20-minute drive west of Miami International Airport and in the direction of the Everglades, FIU's campus is there, and a few blocks away is the engineering campus. And in the back of the engineering building, there's a couple of acres dedicated to the wall of wind. Basically, you'll see a big warehouse structure whose kind of, one end you can see in the behind me here, the visual. Inside there are 12 electric fans. That each one of those fans is 700 horsepower, meaning the whole setup is 8,400 horsepower. And when they're all turned on, they consume, let's say, 6 megawatts of power every hour. So that's quite a bit of power. And most of the testing is done in the morning hours because from noon on is considered during the summer the high electric load period. So we constrain the testing in the morning. And there's a testing bed that rotates about 16 feet wide. Different structures can be put on that, instrumentation attached, and you can drive these winds up to the level where, we see where the failure happens. And we've tested roofs, we've tested components, windows, doors, garage doors. We've tested different ways of assembling walls and so forth to see, how strong they can withstand these winds. So that knowledge has been recorded, accumulated, and Florida's building codes have benefited from that. So have building codes of the coastal and Atlantic areas. I wish that more states and counties would adapt and adopt the codes that we have in South Florida, because as we see, hurricanes can happen anywhere along the Gulf Coast or the Atlantic, even up to New York and New England.
I've seen some of these simulators through like shake rooms or do flooding. How similar is a wall of wind compared to these other simulators, and how might they be different other than the obvious element of wind as much as they can?
Yeah, basically it's a similar concept. You have a kind of contained environment where you place a say a subject building or assembly, and you subject it to the hazard. That hazard could be wind, it could be seismic motion, it could be fire, for example, or rain, and you have a lot of instrumentation that's hooked up to that. A lot of our instrumentation is under the floor, and the wiring is kind of pulled up through the bottom, so it's not damaged during the testing, and the damage that obviously the building or subassembly may be subject to. And you have a control room where you're monitoring both visually and with the instrumentation and recording all the information that's collected. And basically the engineers kind of design a program to answer certain questions. So each test program has an objective of answering, a number of questions on whether the structure can survive or what alterations in design would perform better. And the data can help answer those questions. And obviously that opens the door for even more questions, more research. So it's a never-ending kind of, environment of research. And that's why a lot of different universities, a lot of different organizations kind of collaborate in doing that. But the Wall of Wind is a unique facility. There's no other facility like it that in the US is available for this type of research. The insurance industry has their own facility, which is called the Institute for Building and Home Safety in South Carolina, that can only go up to 125 miles an hour, but it's only available to the insurance companies to do their testing. So research by universities or private companies cannot be done there. So this is a unique facility. It's one of a kind, I think, in the whole world. And we're very honored to have it at FIU in South Florida.
So I think you've touched on this a little bit, but can you describe a little bit more about how cities and engineers can learn from the Wall of Wind? Like, what can they learn, and is it already working? Has it already changed a little bit how buildings susceptible to hurricanes are being designed?
Yeah, definitely. We've learned a lot over the past several decades because unfortunately the building code system in the US has been a fragmented one and not very consistent. We do not have national codes. Most people don't know that the codes are left up to the states, and even in some cases, the states kind of say, to the counties, do what you want to do. If you want to have a code, you can have one. If you don't want it, you cannot have one. So we have pretty much a quilt of different codes, and you buy a house, you don't know, even for me as a person in the field, if you tell me go to this town this year and find out what this house was built, what the standard was built toward, it's a lot of work to find that. So there's no reservoir directory to kind of help you. But we know today what survives and what doesn't survive. And we saw an example of that last fall. Hurricane Ian really devastated the southwestern part of Florida and kind of, went through the middle part of the state. And in the aftermath of that, teams, including FIU and other researchers, kind of did their reconnaissance, visiting and looking and collecting data on buildings. And it was very clear that the buildings that were built to the higher standards, let's say after Andrew, after 1995, survived. And the ones that were built before that did not survive. There's also a high vulnerability in mobile homes, manufactured homes, especially the older ones. And next month, in fact, at the Wall of Wind, we're going to be doing a test that the state of Florida is sponsoring on mobile homes, because that's really a weak spot in the built environment. And we have millions of mobile homes in this country. And unfortunately, the number has grown considerably in the very vulnerable southern states. So the data coming out of this research can really help the code modeling organizations like the International Code Council, which really drafts model codes in kind of improving those codes. Then those codes are, adopted voluntarily, let's say, by the states that have different timelines. And unfortunately, the states can modify them. I would hope they would make them even stronger, but in most cases, they're made weaker. Unfortunately, because home builders prefer weaker codes because they end up with cheaper construction and they feel they can make a bigger profit. And in the end, the consumer, who's the one footing the bill, pays the price. So I'm hoping that in the future, through your efforts in the media and things that I'm trying to do with my organization, we can get the message out to the public that the best thing you can do is to have a strong house. And in most cases, that means if you're building or renovating a house, to go above the code, to go to something that's better than your local code. Because I like to say, and others in the industry say, that a house built to a building code is the weakest house you can legally build. And it's minimum wage, so to speak. And in what part of our life do we adhere to the minimum? Not in healthcare, not in education, not in even our clothing and our other consumer items. And yet, in the most important purchase of our lives, the most important thing that will protect our house and and whatever our household collections and everything, the government essentially puts us at the minimum and doesn't tell us, look, this is not good enough. It's only good enough for you to escape, but not good enough to protect the asset. And we need to be able to protect our assets, because the destruction happening is escalating, and climate's only going to get worse. So this is basic research that proves that resilient construction works, and the field experience supports that. On top of that, from the disasters we're seeing, I mentioned earlier the insurance organization, IBHS, the Institute for Business and Home Safety. They created an above code standard called Fortified, which I'm very supportive of, and that essentially allows consumers to say, I don't want just a house built to code, or my roof, when I replace the roof, I want an above code roof, not one that's just going to survive in an EF1, let's say tornado, or EF1 hurricane. I want something that can survive an EF3 or an EF4 hurricane. And the Fortified standard will allow that, even in parts of the country which still have low standards. And believe me, if you look at the map, a big part of the states on the coastal Gulf and the coastal Atlantic, the codes are still too low.
So in terms of further getting out the message, what would you say to civil and structural engineers who perhaps don't have access directly to the Wall of Wind? How can they take what's been learned there, and can they apply those ideas of sustainability, further structural safety into their own designs? Like, what advice would you give them from what you've learned?
Yeah, I'd say, the information is out there. Sometimes it's fragmented. For example, for hurricane, for me, the best practice, the global best practice today is the South Florida Building Code. So if you want to build something, that will last a hurricane, look at what Miami-Dade is doing for wind, and you pretty much will cover that. Of course, that will be something more expensive, and you've got to convince the customer that it's worth the money, and that's where the education comes in. So unfortunately, we're not educating consumers to prioritize resilience over cosmetics. I mean, most of the money on renovation and remodeling goes into the better kitchen, the fancy bathroom, the closet space. I mean, all those are great things, but if your house is weak, all those will go to the dumpster if a hazard happens. So, in terms of priorities, making your house stronger, is the number one thing. I like to say that let's say 80% of your vulnerability or resilience, is determined at the moment you select a house. The moment you select a house, that location of that house and the way it's constructed is basically 80% of your vulnerability. 15, let's say, percent is the improvements or renovations or other things that you do while you're there. And less than 5% are the things you do the last, few days, when you get that warning that a, storm is approaching and you're, trying to shutter off the windows and, fill the sandbags or do things like that. So really the most important part of our choice is when we select a location and when we select the type of house, and second, when we remodel. And fortunately today we've got some tools, some good tools and references there. If you go to my website, buildingresilient.com, I collaborated a few years ago with another nonprofit to develop a first of its kind buyer's guide to resilient homes. You'll find it as a resource there that kind of takes a consumer step by step at the things they should look for when they're comparing houses. And these are things that typically the realtor and the property industry won't point at. But I'm trying to make smarter consumer to ask the right questions and to do their own research because these things will affect their well-being and their pocketbook down the road. And that guide, the buyer's guide, is not just useful for buyers, but also for people looking to renovate and remodel, because a lot of those suggestions there and things to look for are things you can do when you're prioritizing your remodeling budget. If you want to assess the flood risk of an area, of course, FEMA has their flood maps, and some states require disclosure. Many don't. Half of the states in the country don't require disclosure. And unfortunately, FEMA maps are a bit outdated. And second, they're political in the sense, there's pressures on FEMA to, try to minimize the flood risk areas. But I found that a better resource is another nonprofit called First Street Foundation, and they've come up with a free flood risk rating called Risk Factor. And if you Google that and put your address, and they won't, ask you for money or collect your personal information, you can see your flood risk and learn what you can do. And it's a 1 to, let's say, 10 scale. If you're a 5 or above, that location that you're looking to buy, compared to other locations, because you want to be below 5. And if you do decide to do that 5 and above, they'll suggest things that you should consider improving on to reduce the chance of flooding, such as wet proofing and dry proofing. And we can get into that if you're interested. But there's so many things. As I mentioned earlier, one of the hardest things to assess is what was the wind rating that a house was built toward. And I have to say that most of the houses built in the U.S. in most of the country, before 2000, were built to 90 miles an hour or below, and that's not going to survive even an EF0 tornado or a strong downwind. So they're very vulnerable. The coastal homes that are built stronger either have what we call the hurricane straps. If they're built with wood, have the metal attachments that kind of attach the roof more firmly to the walls and the walls more firmly to the foundation. Those can survive up to 135 if they're done properly under the fortified standard, for example. And if you want to go to the South Florida standard, which will take you to 170 or 180, you need to be building with reinforced concrete, either block or poured concrete or tilt up to be able to survive those kind of winds. So we know the solutions, we have the choices. We're doing it in certain parts of the country, but we're not, doing it as fast as we need everywhere. And the hazards are growing.
Specifically toward the engineers who might be designing these structures before they're built, or designing the remodeling so that they're better fit. What are some specific things that they can do when they're creating these designs to make them more stable and resilient before the thing's even built in the first place?
Well, one of the key principles that we learned from the wall of wind is that the roof is the most vulnerable part of the house or the building. And therefore, making sure that the roof will not fly off, which means, we found out that, you can't use straight nails. You can't use those nail guns that we used to, see builders build with, that they just, pop the nails in, because they'll as easily pop out. You need nails we call ring shank nails that have grooves in them. You need a certain spacing, we call it, at least 6 inch apart, on the roof rafters and trusses. So, there's a standard, and that standard is described in the fortified documentation, and it's also described in other literature. But the roof is the most important part of the house, and what, it gets lost first. And also, when you're thinking about fire, and big part of the country is subject to fire, an A-rated fire A-rated roof is essential if you're near the wildlife interface, or have a lot of trees around you, or even to protect you from a neighbor's house. So I wouldn't go below that, and generally non-combustible materials. The second most vulnerable part wind-wise is the garage door, because when you lose that garage door, basically the house blows up like a balloon and starts tearing apart, the rest of the house. So a reinforced garage door that's wind rated, again specified for, let's say, 135 mile an hour at least, which means that it will have reinforcement on the door itself, and also a stronger kind of frame that attaches to the walls, is essential. And then from there you go on to the windows and the doors. And my preference would be, again, a minimum of 135 mile an hour for those. If you address those kind of 3 areas, you have addressed, let's say, more than 80% of the wind risk. And there are similar things you can do to address water risk and fire risk, and then you get to seismic risk, in the western states and even certain parts of the Atlantic, the Mississippi area, like Memphis. Most people don't know has a serious seismic risk and needs to be doing something. Unfortunately, they haven't done much.
And so as they're doing these specifications and tolerances, these are things that they can find just online to see what they are, just so they can try and meet in their designs.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Unfortunately, the way we build, 90% of our buildings in the U.S. are single family homes, but believe it or not, we have, the urban sprawl, we know about it, but, unfortunately, engineers kind of, exited the door from the mass speculative home construction decades ago. So, these homes are built like cookie cutters from, menus that are in the building codes that are not strong enough, and no engineer even makes a calculation or gets involved in it. And, the home builders love it because it's cheaper for them. So engineers get involved in custom built houses, and those typically, they have the choice there of building something stronger. The media has pictures of the last house surviving, let's say in Mexico Beach. If you look that up, there was one house there that was built, custom built house, built to a much higher standard, and that was the only house standing. So we know it works. And they also have a say, let's say, in the larger high-rise buildings, and also the commercial buildings and institutional buildings. So there, the codes tend to be higher because the home builders are not lobbying, as strongly as they are on homes to keep the standards down. But even there, the engineers can look to go above some of those codes to protect themselves. I'm working with a global organization, the World Bank, on a rating for buildings that they're introducing in the developing world, called the Building Resilience Index, that goes through a list of mitigation measures depending on the applicable hazards in each location. And I'm hoping next year to be able to train engineers in the US to use that also. It's called the Building Resilience Index. It's been launched in the Philippines. It's being tested in the Caribbean. in other countries in Asia, but it can be as useful in the US and Europe. And that will give a much more objective way of rating buildings, but will also show engineers what mitigation measures are needed to be able to get to a higher level of resilience. So we need that. It's going to be similar to what we call the LEED, which is the green rating for buildings, but this will rate resilience, not energy efficiency. For me, consumer education is important to be done, and obviously the engineer, the architect, they always have to interact with the consumer. And yes, they may have the knowledge, they may have the ideas, but kind of explaining to the consumer how important it is, and we don't have enough kind of information on that. In my website, you'll see a study that I did with Wharton University a year ago. We went back to Mexico Beach, which suffered Hurricane Michael and a terrible disaster there 3 years later, and surveyed the residents there to understand what they experienced after that, how difficult and how long it took them to rebuild. And this was a kind of a middle income area, and most people were insured. In fact, some had both flood and homeowners insurance, and yet it's been very tough for these people to rebuild. The insurance, dealing with insurance claims is never an easy task, and most people it's taken 2-3 years to rebuild, and you don't want to go through that. So I like to tell people the cost of a disaster is much more than you imagine, and therefore the investment you make, that extra 5, whatever, even 10% upfront to be in a safer home is probably the best investment you can make in your life. And that's a message we need to get across, so that the consumers are asking for that, or the engineers and architects and builders can have an easier time also convincing consumers to go above code.